The scream stopped at precisely 11 minutes past midnight. No thunderclap, no gunfire, no warning, just silence, the kind that suffocates the soul. Beneath Randolph Manor in Annapolis, October 13th, 1796, a 19-year-old bride clawed at the limestone walls of her own home, while her wedding guests waltzed above her. White silk shredded, fingertips bled. Her voice cracked against the stone until it no longer could. They believed they were celebrating love. They were celebrating her burial, because on this night, Margaret Randolph was not given a husband. She was given a tomb. And every brick laid against her prison was cemented with a conspiracy that stretched from her father to her uncle, to the most respected families of Maryland's colonial elite. The fatal wedding was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, but a carefully engineered execution dressed in lace and roses. A ritual of power, a silence bought with inheritance. And it was not just Margaret who was buried. It was the truth itself. You were never meant to know this story. It was locked beneath basements and bricked over by history, hidden in whispers of family records, smothered under the polite lies of American aristocracy. But tonight, you and I descend into that chamber. Tonight, we exhume what was meant to stay sealed. This is not only the story of one bride betrayed. It is a mirror reflecting how power operates, how families, governments, and institutions sacrifice their own blood to preserve control. Margaret's screams are not just the past. They are the echo of every truth silenced in plain sight. And if you listen carefully, you will hear them beneath the floorboards of history itself. So stay. Listen. Because what begins as the tale of a wedding gone wrong will end with revelations about control systems you live under today. Systems no less brutal, no less manipulative, no less engineered than the brick tomb beneath Randolph Manor. Her last breath marked the beginning of their fortune, and the beginning of our descent. Margaret Randolph was not chosen for love. She was chosen for her inheritance. By 19, she stood as one of the wealthiest young women in the Chesapeake Bay region, an heiress worth over £12,000 in cash and property, with more wealth to come from Baltimore and Philadelphia estates. In a society built on debt, land, and social climbing, she was both prize and target. Her fortune was meant to secure dynasties, not freedom. And the men closest to her understood that her very existence was a threat to their survival. Her father, Cornelius Randolph, carried himself like a titan of commerce. He wore imported coats, dined with governors, and spoke with the confidence of a man who had conquered seas. But behind the facade, his empire was rotting. Bad debts, seized ships, reckless speculation, all hidden under polished mahogany and whispered reassurances. He had borrowed against his daughter's future, mortgaging her inheritance to creditors who were already sharpening their knives. Without her wealth, Cornelius would face not only financial ruin, but public disgrace and debtor's prison. His reputation was a mask, and that mask was slipping, and so a plan emerged. Quiet, deliberate, poisoned at its root. Margaret's fiancé was not the Virginia gentleman he claimed, but an impostor, Thomas Carrington, whose real name was Garrett. A former servant turned fraud. His ambition was as ruthless as it was hollow. To him, Margaret was not a bride, but a door. A door to legitimacy, to wealth, to power. Together, he and Cornelius formed an unholy pact. Wed the girl, inherit the fortune, and silence her forever. But conspiracies never operate alone. They breed networks. Cornelius pulled in his brother Edmund, a lawyer drowning in gambling debts. He bound their family doctor with threats of exposure. He recruited a magistrate who would look the other way. What appeared to Anne, a polis society as a respectable wedding, was in truth a stage play, scripted by desperation, directed by greed, and the stage was her own home. Randolph Manor was built on limestone, its basement thick-walled, soundproof, perfect for storage, or imprisonment. Margaret had grown up knowing every corner of that house. Yet on her wedding night, those familiar stones became her coffin. The most chilling fact? Everyone who mattered in Annapolis society attended the wedding. 47 guests, 47 witnesses, 47 people who danced above her while she screamed beneath their feet. This was not just a family crime. It was a community ritual of silence. And silence, in every age, is the first weapon of control. October 13th, 1796, did not dawn like a wedding day. It dawned like a funeral. The Chesapeake winds were bitter, carrying a salt chill that cut through the autumn air. The Manor's grand windows rattled in their frames, and the sky itself hung low and metallic, as though nature already knew what would be buried before midnight. Margaret woke not with excitement, but with dread. For weeks, she had dreamed of darkness, of being trapped in stone chambers where familiar voices whispered about her death. Those dreams now felt less like nightmares, and more like prophecy. Her white silk gown was no longer just a symbol of purity. It was a trap. As her maid Sarah dressed her, Margaret discovered heavy lead weights sewn into the hem and sleeves. They dragged at her body with every movement, turning her bridal costume into a chain. When she questioned why, the answer was hollow. Your father said it would hang more elegantly. She knew better. She felt the truth in the unnatural pull of the fabric. Someone wanted her to be heavy, slow, unable to run. The wedding dress itself was an instrument of control. As the ceremony began, 47 guests smiled politely, clinking glasses, reciting their lines in this theater of deception. Reverend Miles officiated with the calm of routine, but Margaret's eyes darted across the room, searching for refuge, finding only masks. Her new husband's hands trembled as he slid the ring onto her finger, sweat glistening despite the cold. Her father checked his pocket watch again and again, as though he were timing not a union but an execution. And the guests, those who had known her since childhood, looked at her not with joy, but with something darker. Not envy, not admiration, pity. They knew more than they admitted. This is how power hides its crimes, not by secrecy alone, but by performance. By turning murder into ritual, betrayal into ceremony, silence into complicity. It is not only the conspirators who kill, it is the audience that refuses to see. The crowd drank wine, ate oysters, and forced laughter while the true purpose of the day crept closer, brick by brick. And above it all, Margaret stood in her weighted gown, smiling through clenched teeth, playing her part in a script written by men who had already signed her death warrant. Her wedding was not her beginning. It was the final act of a story she had never been allowed to write. It happened by accident, or perhaps by fate. During the wedding breakfast, Margaret slipped into her father's study to fetch a handkerchief. What she found instead was the truth, delivered through a thin wall not built to contain secrets. Her father's voice, low and deliberate, carried through the wood. The basement is prepared. The wine barrels are moved. William has brought the tools. The limestone walls are perfect. Margaret froze, every muscle locked. Her father was not talking about wine. He was talking about a chamber, a plan, a silence. Then Thomas's voice, her new husband's voice, trembling, uncertain. Are you sure the walls are thick enough? What if someone hears, and then her Uncle Edmund, the lawyer, calm and clinical, replying with the surgeon's precision. Those walls are 3 feet thick, built into the bluff itself. A cannon could fire down there and no one upstairs would notice. The acoustics are perfect. Nothing will escape. Margaret pressed her ear to the wall, her blood turning to ice. They were speaking of imprisonment, of vanishing, of her. The words cut deeper with each sentence. Her father continued. We'll tell the guests she retired early with a headache. By morning, we'll have the story of her lover prepared. They'll believe she ran away in shame. When her body is found in the river, the lead weights will explain everything. Lead weights. The dress. Her mind snapped the pieces together with terrifying clarity. They had dressed her not as a bride, but as a corpse. The white silk was her shroud. She forced herself to listen as the plan unfolded in horrifying detail. Wait until the guests were drunk on wine and music. lure her to the basement under the pretense of rest, and brick her into the limestone chamber before dawn. A magistrate would certify the disappearance. A doctor would forge the cause of death. Her fortune would flow upward into the pockets of the men who had just toasted her happiness. Margaret's lungs seized. For a moment, panic threatened to overtake her. But something colder rose instead: clarity. She understood then that she was surrounded not by family, but by predators. And she was not a bride. She was prey. The footsteps drew near. She pulled away from the wall, fumbling with desk drawers to feign distraction as Thomas entered, smiling with his serpent's charm. "There you are, my dear. The guests are asking for you." Margaret smiled back. But her smile was a mask, stretched thin over terror. She walked back into her own execution, carrying with her a secret she dared not speak. The afternoon wore on, and with it came the slow torture of performance. Margaret returned to the reception hall with Thomas at her side, her heart hammering beneath the weighted silk, every breath measured, every gesture forced. She had overheard enough to know that nearly every man she loved, her father, her uncle, her new husband, was conspiring to erase her existence. Yet the hall was filled with laughter, music, and congratulations. To reveal the truth now would make her seem hysterical, insane, ungrateful. Who would believe that her own father was plotting to seal her into stone while his friends danced overhead? So she smiled. She raised her glass. She danced the traditional steps, the gown dragging against the polished floor like a chain. Each movement was agony, not only from the lead weights, but from the suffocating knowledge that every polite compliment was a dagger hidden in velvet. "What a lovely bride," they whispered. "What a fine match." She saw their faces more clearly now. Not admiration, not envy, but something colder. Pity. They knew, or at least they suspected. And still, they drank. Still, they smiled. Still, they obeyed the script. The wine flowed freely, deliberately, as if each glass were designed not to celebrate but to distract. The guests became louder, their laughter emptier, their eyes glassier. Margaret felt as though she were watching a stage play in which every actor knew the ending but her. And yet, she now carried the heaviest secret of all: that by midnight, the music would continue while she vanished beneath their feet. Every attempt at escape ran against the walls of power. If she cried out, her father would dismiss her as overwrought. If she fled, Thomas would chase her, claiming she was faint or unstable. If she begged for help, the magistrate himself, the very authority who should protect her, was already bought and bound into the conspiracy. The house, the guests, the very social fabric of Annapolis were complicit, and so Margaret did what countless victims of power have done across history. She pretended. She became the mask they demanded she wear, even as the truth devoured her from within. For hours she endured the cruel theater, dancing on the stage above her tomb, every step dragging her closer to the moment of descent. The violins played. The guests cheered. And beneath the music, Margaret's silence screamed louder than anything her lips could say. As twilight bled into night, the manor shifted. The candles were lit, the violins sharpened their tones, and the celebration grew louder, wilder, almost feverish. The air inside the Randolph home thickened with sweat, wine, and the sour edge of anticipation. To the guests, it was the height of festivity. To Margaret, it was the sound of a noose tightening. Her father's eyes darted constantly to the clock. Thomas's laughter grew more hollow with each toast. Her Uncle Edmund paced the edges of the room like a wolf trapped in silk and lace. Margaret noticed the signal moments, the glances exchanged, the small nods, the subtle gestures. The conspirators were synchronizing. Every toast, every step of the dance floor was merely an interval between one tick of the clock and the next. Margaret's body screamed for flight. Every nerve told her to run into the night, to tear the weighted silk from her body, and flee into the woods. But she knew what her escape would look like. A frantic bride crashing into the cold streets of Annapolis, breathless, incoherent, dismissed as unstable. And behind her, the very authorities she would beg for protection. Men like Brackenridge, the magistrate, were part of the design. The system itself was her cage. The music rose higher. Guests clapped in rhythm, unaware they were clapping over her heartbeat. And then she saw her father move to Thomas, whispering something she could not hear. Thomas's face hardened, the charm stripped away for a moment, replaced with the grim resolve of a man about to cross an unholy threshold. Her nightmare was materializing with dreadful precision. The lead weights in her dress pulled at her legs, exhausting her, slowing her. Every step she took on the dance floor became heavier, as though the house itself wanted her rooted in place, ready to be buried in its foundations. She remembered the dreams, stone walls closing in, whispers deciding her fate. Tonight, the dream would become her prison. Around her, laughter rang, glasses clinked, skirts swirled. Above the din, her father raised his voice, announcing more dancing, more celebration, encouraging the guests to drink deeper. It was the distraction before the strike, the sleight of hand before the vanishing act. Margaret realized with a cold certainty. The descent was coming. The basement was waiting. And the house itself seemed to lean in, eager to consume her. The music thundered as the hour drew late, and Margaret's body felt weaker beneath the crushing weight of silk and lead. Her lips smiled, her eyes played their role, but inside, terror roared like a storm. She knew what was coming. The basement was not a place of refuge. It was her tomb. And yet, in a house filled with 47 guests, she was already alone. It began with a subtle touch. Thomas's hand slipped around hers, cold and firm, guiding her gently from the dance floor. His voice was low, soft, calculated to seem caring. "You must be tired, my love. The air here is heavy. Come with me, just for a few minutes." To the crowd, it appeared as nothing more than a considerate husband caring for his exhausted bride. But to Margaret, each step toward the door was a march toward oblivion. She tried to stall. She mentioned the next dance, the guests awaiting her return. But Thomas's grip tightened ever so slightly, and his smile, so flawless in public, flickered with a private command. Her father watched from across the room, nodding almost imperceptibly. Edmund leaned against the wall, his hands clenched, his face pale. The stage was set, and Margaret was being escorted to her execution, as though to a waltz. The crowd barely noticed as she slipped from the hall. Some raised glasses, others laughed, too drunk to care. That is the cruelty of ritualized power. It hides its violence in plain sight. Everyone sees, but no one looks. Everyone hears, but no one listens. The sacrifice is performed openly, disguised as courtesy. And those who suspect choose silence, because silence feels safer than truth. As Thomas led her down the corridor, Margaret's heart raced so violently, she feared it might burst. She searched for escape in the shadows, in the windows, in the familiar corners of the home she had once known as sanctuary. But every path seemed blocked by the weight of inevitability. The very architecture her family had built to project wealth and permanence was now weaponized against her. The basement door appeared ahead, darker than the hall itself, its iron latch glinting in the candlelight like a blade. Thomas whispered again, "Just a moment, my dear. The cool air will help you." His words dripped with poisoned gentleness, the mask of care concealing the hand of betrayal, and as her fingers brushed the wood of the basement door, Margaret understood. Once she crossed that threshold, the world above would continue dancing. While she descended into silence, the door creaked open with a groan that seemed to echo across centuries. Margaret hesitated at the threshold, her body stiff with instinct, her soul screaming to turn back. But Thomas's hand was firm against her back, guiding her forward with a pressure disguised as tenderness. "Just a moment, my dear. You'll feel better," he murmured. The words dripped like honey, but their sweetness burned. The stairs descended into darkness, each step colder than the last. The candles upstairs faded into muffled shadows as the air thickened with damp limestone and mildew. Margaret felt the weight of the house pressing down, as though every stone longed to bury her alive. She glanced back, one final look at the world of light and laughter. But Thomas's figure loomed behind her, blocking the way. There was no retreat. The basement walls glistened with moisture. The air clung to her skin, clammy and suffocating. Barrels lined the far wall, but their usual order was disturbed. Space had been cleared. Tools leaned against the stone. Chisels, mortar, bricks stacked in neat anticipation. Her stomach twisted. This was not storage. It was preparation. She was not the first object to be placed here, but she would be the last. Her breath caught as she realized the acoustics. She had grown up playing in this basement, testing echoes, knowing that certain corners carried sound upward in strange ways. Tonight, that knowledge mocked her. No matter how loud she screamed, the guests above, drunk on wine and music, would never hear. The walls had been designed to keep sound in. The perfect vault. Thomas gestured toward a chair placed unnaturally at the center of the room. Sit, rest. You'll feel the coolness revive you. His tone was gentle, almost convincing, but Margaret's mind saw the trap in every detail. The chair facing the wall, the tools ready, the cleared floor waiting to be sealed. She stood for Nay, Ozin, her pulse hammering, her fingers clutching the weighted folds of her gown like a lifeline. Upstairs, muffled strains of a violin reached her ears, faint, distorted, as though the world of joy was already slipping away. Here, beneath the manor, there was only dampness, stone, and silence. Margaret realized the horror. She had stepped not into refuge, but into her grave. And the door above was closing. The door thudded shut above, cutting off the last thread of candlelight from the hall. Margaret's lungs seized, her chest tightening as though the house itself had pressed its stone weight upon her. The basement was colder now, its damp air gnawing into her skin. But colder still was the realization. The stage was set, and she was the only actor who had not chosen her role. Thomas stepped closer, his voice a soft command. Sit, my dear. You need your strength. But Margaret's feet rooted themselves to the floor. She met his eyes, once the eyes she had believed charming, now nothing but pits of calculation. Behind him, she saw the faint flicker of lamplight, her father descending, Edmund close behind, their shadows stretching long across the damp stone. 3 men, blood, husband, uncle, every protector turned predator, each carrying his own desperation, each ready to bury her for his survival. Cornelius's voice cut the silence. Do not make this difficult, Margaret. It will be quicker this way. You must understand, it is necessary. Necessary. The word rang like a death sentence. Margaret's mind raced. If she screamed, the walls would devour it. If she ran, the lead-weighted gown would drag her down. If she begged, these men, her own family, had already decided her fate. But if she could delay, if she could fracture their unity, perhaps she could create a crack in their perfect scheme. She forced her voice steady. Father, what are you doing? Do you know what this will mean? People will ask. They will notice. Her eyes darted to Edmund, the weak link, his face pale and clammy in the lamplight. Uncle, you're a man of law. You'll be destroyed if this truth ever comes out. His jaw tightened, guilt flashing across his face, but Cornelius's glare silenced him. Margaret shifted her gaze to Thomas, her voice trembling now, not with fear but with defiance. And you think you will inherit wealth through this. You've built your life on lies. Do you think those lies won't devour you too? For a moment she saw the flicker of doubt, a crack in his mask, but Cornelius stepped forward, his face hard as limestone. Enough! He gestured to Thomas. Do it. The basement grew smaller, the walls pressing in. Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears. She knew the bricks would rise soon, one by one, until the world forgot her. But she also knew something her betrayers did not, that she would not vanish quietly. The silence shattered with motion. Thomas lunged first, reaching for Margaret's arm with the hesitance of a man obeying, not choosing. She twisted away, the lead weights of her gown dragging at her legs, but adrenaline giving her speed. The silk tore against the damp stone wall as she stumbled, her breath ragged. "Margaret!" her father barked, his voice thunderous in the vault. "Do not disgrace yourself further." His words sounded less like a command to a daughter, and more like the voice of a judge delivering a sentence. He advanced, slow, deliberate, certain that the weight of blood, duty, and the gown would corner her. Margaret's hands clawed at the stacked bricks, at the tools, searching for anything sharp, anything solid. Her fingers brushed cold iron, the handle of a trowel, and for one brief instant she felt power in her grip. She turned, raising it between herself and the three men. Her voice cracked, but it cut through the damp air with fury. "Come closer, and you will bleed." Thomas froze. Edmund swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. But Cornelius only sneered, stepping closer, his shadow stretching across the stone floor. "Child," he hissed, "you think you can fight the hand that gave you life? You think you can break the blood that made you?" Margaret's chest heaved, her knuckles white on the iron handle. For a heartbeat, time held. The flicker of doubt in Thomas's eyes widened. The shame on Edmund's face deepened. She saw it, the fracture in their unity, the weakness in the design. If she could widen it, perhaps the bricks would never be laid. But Cornelius's will was iron. With a sudden movement, he grabbed the hem of her gown, yanking her off balance. The lead weights betrayed her, pulling her hard to the ground. The trowel clattered from her hands, skittering across the damp stone. Thomas moved then, pinning her wrists, his face pale with dread, as he could not bear to look her in the eyes. Edmund stood back, trembling, torn between complicity and collapse. Margaret thrashed, screamed, her voice raw against the limestone. But the walls devoured the sound, swallowing it whole. Above them, the violins played on, laughter spilling into the night, as though nothing below existed. The first brick was lifted. The scrape of stone against stone echoed like a death knell. Margaret's heart hammered. This was no longer a plan. This was happening. The scrape of brick against mortar filled the chamber like a dirge. It was a sound no bride should ever hear, a sound meant for graves. Edmund's trembling hands lifted the first stone, setting it into place with a hollow finality. The echo was unbearable. An echo not only of stone meeting stone, but of a life being sealed away. Moment by moment, Margaret strained against Thomas's grip, her wrists raw beneath his fingers. "Stop!" she cried, her voice breaking. "You cannot do this. You cannot bury your own blood." The words rattled the chamber, but Cornelius only sneered. "Blood is nothing against debt. Blood is nothing against ruin," he growled. "Better for one daughter to vanish than for the Randolph name to collapse. Another brick, then another, each set with mechanical precision, as if the men were not sealing flesh and spirit, but merely repairing a wall." Edmund's hands shook so violently that mortar smeared across his cuffs. His lips moved as if in prayer, but no words emerged. Margaret locked her gaze on him, desperation cutting through her terror. "Uncle, you know this is damnation. You know this is murder. When your time comes, will you beg for mercy you never gave?" He faltered. His hand froze midair, the brick slipping slightly. For a moment, the mask of silence cracked. But Cornelius's eyes burned into him, iron hard, commanding. Edmund swallowed and placed the stone. The wall grew. Margaret's screams rose, her voice tearing against the vault, her body twisting beneath Thomas's weight. But the gown betrayed her at every turn, its weighted silk clinging to the stone floor, dragging her down like a shroud that longed for burial. Brick by brick, her world narrowed. The damp air thickened, heavy with lime and earth. The sound of the violins above, the only reminder of life, faded beneath the rhythm of stone. Every placement was a heartbeat stolen, every smear of mortar or a page torn from her future. And as the wall climbed, Margaret's thoughts grew sharper, colder. She realized this was not just the end of a life. It was the perfect crime. A disappearance disguised as shame. A silence built into stone. A daughter rewritten into scandal. But she also knew one thing with dreadful certainty. Though they could bury her body, they could never bury the truth of what was done in this house. The wall had risen to her shoulders now. She could feel the cold draft of air shrinking, the chamber tightening, as if the stone itself conspired with her enemies. Margaret no longer thrashed. The silk weights had drained her strength, her wrists burned from struggle, her throat raw from screaming. But silence was more terrifying than sound, and so she began to speak, not as a victim, but as a judge. "You think this wall will hold me?" she rasped, glaring at each conspirator through the narrowing gap. "But what you build here tonight will outlive you. Every brick you lay is a brand on your soul. Every smear of mortar binds your names to a curse you cannot escape." Her father shifted uncomfortably, but Thomas smirked, holding her pinned. "Curse all you wish," he sneered. "The dead hold no power." Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper, sharp as a blade. "The dead always hold the most power." Edmund trembled, his hands barely able to guide the next brick into place. He avoided her eyes, but her words hunted him, carving into his conscience. Margaret pressed harder, sensing his weakness. "Uncle, every night you gamble, you pray for fortune, but you've wagered against blood, and blood never forgives. When the dice roll cold, it will be my face you see. When the cards fail, it will be my hand that strikes." He froze, sweat dripping into his eyes. Cornelius barked, "Ignore her. She is delirious." But his voice cracked with unease. Margaret's gaze locked on her father, the man who had raised her, taught her letters, walked her through the orchard when she was small. Her words fell like venom now. "You spoke of saving the Randolph name, but names rot in the mouths of traitors. You will not be remembered as a savior, father. You will be remembered as a man who buried his own daughter alive. That truth will cling to this house, whisper through these halls, seep into every stone." Tom, as forced her chin up, eyes blazing. "You will die here and be forgotten." Margaret leaned forward, her lips almost touching his ear, her breath shallow but fierce. "No, I will die here, and you will be remembered only because of me." The wall was nearly closed. Only a sliver remained, enough for one last look, one last exchange. Margaret straightened, as much as the weighted gown allowed, and fixed her eyes on the flickering candlelight beyond. "If the earth takes me," she declared, her voice carrying an unnatural calm, "then the earth itself will rise against you." The final brick was raised. The chamber fell into shadow. The final brick slid into place with the dull, suffocating thud. For a moment, the flicker of candlelight wavered across Margaret's face, her eyes defiant, her breath sharp and steady. Then darkness swallowed her whole. The mortar sealed, the gap disappeared, and with it, her connection to the living. Inside, the air changed instantly. The damp stench of limestone pressed close, clinging to her throat, coating her tongue with bitter chalk. She could hear her own heartbeat, thundering against the silence. Her breath rasped too loudly, echoing against the stone, reminding her how small this chamber was, how little air remained. Above her, the music still played, the muffled thrum of fiddles and stamping feet, distorted by 3 feet of stone. Laughter, clinking glasses, the cadence of a celebration, all of it now grotesque, mocking. They danced on her grave before the earth had even taken her. Every note was a cruelty. Margaret reached forward in the dark, her fingers finding the cold, freshly mortared stone. She dug her nails in, scraping desperately. Her gown tangled beneath her knees, its weighted hem anchoring her like a chain. She tore at it, fabric ripping, but the lead weights still dragged. Panic surged. She clawed again, skin splitting, nails bending until they bled. The limestone did not yield. Her cries filled the chamber, bouncing back at her, distorted, hollow, as though the stone mocked her with her own voice. She screamed louder, screamed until her throat was raw, screamed until she no longer knew if the sounds were hers or echoes. But slowly, the futility sank in. The wall did not move. No one would come. She was sealed, and the earth was patient. Her body trembled, but her mind, sharp and unwilling to surrender, began to shift. In that suffocating black, Margaret felt something awakening, something ancient, buried deep within her blood. A realization: if she Kahati would not break free, she would not die as prey. She would die as prophecy. Margaret pressed her bloodied hands to the wall, as if anointing it. "These stones will carry me," she whispered hoarsely. "Every man who touched them tonight will feel me in his marrow. This house will remember, and I will not be silent." Her breathing slowed. Steady now. Not surrender, but transformation. The dark was not her grave. It was her witness. Upstairs, the violin shrieked with manic joy. Boots pounded the polished floorboards in a reel. Skirts flared. Tankards clashed. Laughter rolled through Randolph Manor like a tide of oblivion. To the guests, the night was a triumph. An alliance sealed, fortunes joined, a family name rising once more. They toasted Thomas, congratulated Cornelius, admired the gleam of wealth on display. None suspected the bride herself was already erased, hidden just beneath their stamping feet. But in the basement, a very different music played. Margaret's breath rasped against the stone, shallow and urgent. Each inhalation came quicker, as though the air was already thinning. Her fingers brushed the slick walls, searching desperately for any weakness, any seam. Nothing. Only damp limestone, heavy and unyielding. Yet as her nails raked across the surface, the sound became strange, distorted, as if the walls themselves hummed faintly, carrying her touch like a drum. Her mind began to fracture in the dark. The music from above warped into grotesque shapes, violin strings twisting into shrieks, laughter bending into the howls of carrion birds. She pressed her palms to her ears, but the noise lived inside her skull. The chamber seemed to breathe with her, contracting, pulsing, as though alive. She could almost feel the stones leaning closer, listening. Margaret's panic flickered, then hardened into fury. She was not prey. She would not die nameless, voiceless, forgotten. She pressed her bleeding hands flat against the wall, her forehead resting against the cold mortar, and whispered not to the men upstairs, but to the house itself. "Carry me. Remember me. Let no one forget what they buried here. Above." The conspirators smiled and raised their cups higher, but their eyes were restless. Edmund drank too quickly, his hand shaking as he wiped sweat from his brow. Dr. Henley kept glancing at the floorboards, as if he could hear something the others could not. And Cornelius, though he laughed and entertained his guests, checked the time again and again, his voice faltering every time the fiddle paused between songs. It was as though some vibration from below, the faint echo of her hands against stone, the resonance of her voice in the mortar, crept upward, seeding unease in the very men who sealed her. The dance thundered on, but shadows began to move at the edges of their revelry. And Margaret, though buried alive, had already begun her vengeance. The dark was no longer empty. It swam with shapes. Faces bloomed in the stone, mouths yawning wide, eyes glowing with the pale shimmer of damp limestone. At first Margaret recoiled. Certain madness had claimed her. But then the faces began to speak, not with voices of air, but with vibrations that crawled through her skull, resonating with marrow and blood. "You are not the first," they whispered. "And you will not be the last." The realization crushed her chest. This chamber had known others. Forgotten women, buried debts, sacrifices in silence. The walls had been fed before. Randolph wealth was not merely built on trade, but on bodies, sealed and silenced. Generation after generation, Margaret pressed her back against the wall, heart hammering. The faces multiplied, overlapping, screaming without sound. Their anguish pressed into the limestone. She clawed at them, her nails bloody, and when her hands came away, she swore she felt heat. Like the wall itself pulsed with memory. Her head swam. The music above twisted into funereal drums. She saw visions not with her eyes, but in flashes against her skull. Her father, trembling in his study, quill snapping in his hand as debts strangled him. Thomas, cornered in some nameless tavern, a knife pressed to his throat by men he'd cheated. Edmund, feverish and alone, the dice clattering from his shaking fingers as he realized too late that no amount of luck could save him. Margaret gasped, shuddering, but she understood. The darkness was not merely devouring her. It was showing her the unraveling of those who had betrayed her. Their downfall was already written, bound to her entombment. She pressed her bleeding palms against the stone again, this time not with desperation, but with intent. "Then let me be the last," she whispered. "Let this house remember me and curse every man who touched this wall. Let their children hear my brag. Eth in the night. Let no fortune be clean that passes through the Randolph line." The chamber fell still. Even her breath seemed to vanish, suspended in a silence so total it felt sacred. And then, faintly from above, laughter faltered. A glass shattered. Someone had gone pale, without reason. Margaret smiled in the dark. Her lips split and bloodied. The house had heard her. The curse was already taking root. The music faltered. A string snapped on the violin, the sound sharp as a scream. The fiddler cursed under his breath, hands trembling as he tried to retune, but the atmosphere had already shifted. Guests exchanged uneasy glances. Though no one could explain why the room suddenly felt colder, Cornelius forced a laugh, raising his glass higher. "Play on. A broken string is nothing." But even as he spoke, his eyes darted toward the floor, his jaw tight. He alone knew what lay beneath those boards. The weight of it pressed on him, not just the daughter he had sacrificed, but the silence her absence created. Edmund drained another glass of wine, his face pale, his hand shaking so badly that red dripped onto his cuff. He muttered about needing air, but when he approached the door, he hesitated, as though afraid to step beyond the manor's walls. It was as if something unseen held him inside. Dr. Henley wiped sweat from his brow, though the room was cool. He swore he heard something. A faint rhythm, not the fiddle, not the stamping feet. A slower beat, a pounding, as though someone below was striking the stone, again and again, with bare hands. He stared at the floorboards, heart pounding to the same rhythm, until Thomas gripped his shoulder sharply. "Steady yourself, doctor," Thomas hissed, forcing a smile for the guests. But his own hand trembled. In his ear, Margaret's final whisper replayed endlessly. The dead always hold the most power. The guests tried to carry on, but the joy had soured. Conversation stuttered. Laughter rang hollow. A group of women excused themselves early, whispering about headaches, though their eyes flickered nervously toward the corners of the room, as if shadows moved where none should. And then the first glass shattered, not dropped, not spilled, shattered as though struck from within. Shards flew across the table, slicing a guest's hand. The man cried out, clutching his bleeding palm, staring at the untouched glass stem that remained upright. The room froze. Cornelius barked for calm, insisted it was an accident. But deep down, each conspirator knew better. The house was no longer theirs to command. Something below had stirred, and it would not remain silent. The air was failing. Each breath dragged like sandpaper, shallow and thin, leaving her chest burning. Her body shuddered, collapsing against the cold stone, the lead weights of her gown pressing her deeper into the floor as if the grave itself embraced her. Her fingers, raw and torn, trembled with each scrape against the wall. She could no longer tell if the warmth on her skin was blood or the damp breath of the earth, yet the darkness did not feel empty anymore. It pulsed. It whispered. The walls vibrated faintly beneath her touch, as though they carried her heartbeat back to her. A rhythm amplified, distorted, becoming something larger. Margaret realized she was no longer alone in the chamber. The faces she had seen before began to return, clearer now, glowing faintly in the limestone. Women, men, children, mouths open, eyes endless. They were the ones who had been sacrificed before her, entombed in silence, forgotten by history. But in this suffocating black, they were not gone. They lived within the stone, bound to the walls as surely as she was. Margaret pressed her palm against the damp limestone and whispered through broken lips, "I am not afraid." The wall responded with a low guttural hum, so deep it rattled her ribs. It was not language, but she understood. They were welcoming her, folding her into their number. She was becoming more than a victim. She was becoming part of the house itself. Her vision blurred, but in her mind's eye, she saw above, the conspirators laughing nervously, glasses cracking, shadows lengthening. She saw their fear taking root, saw them trapped in their own performance, unable to leave without suspicion. And she felt power stirring in her veins, not of flesh, but of stone and memory. Her lips curled into a faint smile, even as her lungs screamed for air. "Yes," she whispered to the walls. "Carry me upward. Let them hear me. Let them chal doant, ki as I choke. Let them drink my breath, feel my silence in their bones." The chamber seemed to close around her in agreement. The pounding in her skull slowed, her fear dissolved, and in its place rose something vast, something eternal. Margaret Randolph was no longer merely a girl sealed alive. She was becoming a curse with a heartbeat. The air in the great hall had shifted. It was subtle at first, a heaviness that clung to the lungs, an unspoken pressure. Guests fanned themselves despite the cool October night, murmuring about drafts that should not exist in a sealed Georgian manor. The candles flickered erratically, their flames bowing as though pushed by an invisible breath. Cornelius forced another toast, his voice ringing false. "To the union of Randolph and Carrington, may it be remembered forever." The words echoed strangely, rebounding off the walls in a way that set teeth on edge. Laughter followed, but thin, brittle, as if every guest knew something beneath the surface was wrong. Thomas drank deeply, gulping down wine to smother the unease coiling in his gut. But with every swallow, the liquid turned bitter, metallic, like blood. He slammed the goblet down, splattering crimson across the table. For a heartbeat, he swore the stain spread into the shape of a handprint, fingers splayed, pressing upward from beneath the tablecloth. He blinked and it was gone, but his skin crawled. Edmund clutched the edge of his chair, knuckles white. His ears twitched, straining. Beneath the thunder of dancing feet, beneath the hollow merriment, he swore he heard it again. A steady rhythm, faint, but undeniable. Thump, thump, thump. Like hands striking stone. Like a heartbeat deep below, he stood abruptly, chair toppling, startling the nearest guests. "Did you hear that?" he demanded, wild-eyed. Someone's below." Cornelius seized him by the arm, his grip brutal. "Enough," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Not another word." But his own face betrayed the truth. He had heard it too. The room had grown stifling. Guests wiped sweat from their brows, muttering about leaving early. Yet every time one moved toward the door, another blocked the way with forced conversation, as if the house itself conspired to hold them inside. And then the second glass shattered. This time, without anyone touching it. A shriek tore through the hall. Wine bled across the white linen, running in rivulets like veins. The fiddler dropped his bow, hands shaking violently, refusing to play another note. Silence fell. A silence so heavy it seemed to press down from the rafters, up from the floorboards, wrapping the conspirators in invisible chains. In that silence, every man who had touched the wall felt it. Margaret was still breathing. Her chest burned with every inhale, the air thinning into knives. Each gasp scraped her throat raw. Each exhale carried less of her strength. Margaret could feel her body weakening, the leaden gown pinning her like a coffin lid. But as flesh surrendered, something else surged forward, vast and unstoppable. Her mind slipped beyond the chamber, past stone and mortar, rising like smoke into the beams of the manor above. She saw them, her father with his forced smile, Thomas gripping his goblet too tightly, Edmund trembling, the doctor drenched in sweat. Their faces swam before her in perfect clarity, though her eyes were closed in the dark. It was as if the house itself had become her sight. The walls throbbed with her heartbeat. Every beam, every floorboard carried her pulse upward. The violins were silent now, but a deeper music rang through the bones of the house, her rhythm, her curse, her vow. Margaret pressed her hands once more to the limestone, blood smearing across the damp surface. "I give myself to you," she whispered. "Carry me into them. Let them drink my breath. Let them dance on my grave, and feel my hands around their throats." The limestone shuddered beneath her palms. The voices in the walls, the lost souls of those who had been sealed before, rose in chorus. They did not mourn. They exulted. Margaret was not joining them as another victim. She was becoming their voice, their fury, their deliverance. Her final breaths came ragged, shallow. Yet instead of terror, a strange calm overtook her. Death no longer felt like an ending. It felt like expansion. With every gasp, she seeped further into the stone, into the beams, into the trembling candles above. She was everywhere now. In the mortar, in the silence, in the fear crawling beneath the conspirator's skin. And as the blackness closed fully around her, Margaret smiled. A broken, bloodied smile. For though the sewn had buried her, they had unleashed something far greater. She was no longer a bride. She was a haunting. The hall was unraveling. The musicians refused to play. Their instruments hung limp in their hands, as if strings and bows had grown too heavy to lift. Guests murmured excuses, eager to leave. But every time someone neared the door, the latch stuck fast. Even Cornelius, in a quiet panic, could not force it open. The manor held them like insects in amber. The air grew thick, humid, oppressive, as though the house itself exhaled decay. Candles guttered low, flames stretched long and unnatural, their light casting shadows that writhed like living things. Then came the sound. At first it was faint, a hollow rhythmic thump, steady as a heart. Guests froze, heads tilting. Some claimed it was only the echo of boots from the dance. But the dance had long ceased, and still the beating grew. Louder, deeper, as though the floor itself pulsed beneath them. Edmund dropped to his knees, clutching his ears. "She's here," he sobbed. "She's beneath us. Can't you hear her?" His voice cracked, the sound of a man breaking. Cornelius barked for silence, his own voice strained, brittle. "There is no one below. You hear nothing but your own foolish guilt." But his face was ash-white, sweat dripping from his temples. A woman screamed as her goblet shattered in her hand, wine spraying like blood across her gown. Another fainted outright, collapsing in a heap as the thumping grew faster, like fists pounding the coffin lid of the earth itself. The chandelier above began to sway, though no wind stirred. Its crystals clinked like 1,000 tiny bells, a mocking accompaniment to the rhythm below. With every swing, its light fractured into harsh shards that carved the room into jagged fragments. And then the whispers began. Not loud, never loud, but threading through the air like smoke. A woman's voice, hoarse, breathless, yet everywhere at once. Some heard words, "Remember me." Others only the rasp of one fighting for air. But every guest felt the same chill. The bride had not left this house. Thomas staggered back from the table, his face contorted in terror. His goblet slipped from his hand, spilling wine that crept across the table in thin rivulets, veins leading to the floorboards. He stared downward, lips quivering. For a moment, he swore he saw her face staring back through the wood, pale and furious, her mouth still moving. The room descended into chaos. Screams tore through Randolph Manor, drowning out the final strains of celebration. The wedding had ended, but something far darker had begun. Guests surged toward the doors, clawing at the brass handles, but the latches would not yield. Panic spread like fire. Women sobbed, men cursed and hammered at the wood until their fists bled. The manor swallowed every sound, the walls holding their terror as if savoring it. The chandelier swayed harder, its iron frame groaning. Crystals snapped free one by one, crashing down like falling stars. A shard slashed across a guest's cheek, drawing a crimson line that dripped onto the parquet floor. The blood seeped into the wood and spread quickly, as though the house drank it. Thomas staggered back against the wall, gasping for breath. His face was ghastly pale, his lips tinged blue. He clawed at his collar, choking. "Air! There's no air!" he rasped, though others around him breathed freely. His knees buckled. His bride's curse was upon him first. Edmund collapsed near the hearth, convulsing, his eyes rolling back. He screamed not at the room, but at something only he could see. Margaret standing over him, her veil dripping with dirt, her fingers reaching. "Get her away!" he shrieked, striking at nothing, leaving his own skin torn and bleeding. Dr. Henley tried to restore order, raising his voice above the chaos. But as he reached for a fallen guest, his hands shook so violently that he dropped his instruments. A stethoscope clattered to the floor, its earpieces rattling. From the chest piece came not silence but a faint muffled sound. A heartbeat. Slow. Wet. Steady. The guests screamed louder, scattering like frightened cattle. Some clawed at the windows, but the glass refused to break, even under fists, even under thrown chairs. The house held them. It would not release its witnesses. Cornelius stood rigid at the head of the table, refusing to move though terror twisted his face. His lips trembled as he whispered to no one in particular. "This is her wedding feast, and indeed it was." The candles flared violently, as if answering, then all at once snuffed out, plunging the hall into blackness. In that pitch dark, the thumping below became deafening, a heartbeat shaking the beams, rattling the crystal shards across the floor. And woven through it, the rasping voice of the bride, everywhere and nowhere. "Remember me." By dawn, Randolph Manor stood silent. The guests had fled in scattered terror, some vanishing into the night never to speak of what they'd seen. Others stumbled to neighboring estates, raving incoherently, their clothes torn, their eyes wild with unnameable fear. A few never left at all. Their bodies were found days later within the manor's halls. Twisted as if they had died mid-struggle against an invisible hand, the conspirators fared no better. Edmund lingered only a few weeks, fevered and incoherent, until he succumbed in a fit of seizures, his final words a choking plea to stop her hands from clawing at his throat. Dr. Henley abandoned his practice, muttering about sounds only he could hear. His journals, later discovered, described a perpetual heartbeat beneath the soil, that followed him wherever he traveled. Thomas, broken and pale, wandered the ports of Annapolis, drowning in drink, his once handsome face ravaged by fear. Some whispered he leapt from the wharf into the Chesapeake, others that he disappeared on a ship cursed never to reach harbor, and Cornelius, he remained in the manor, too proud, too stubborn, or too guilty to leave. Servants abandoned him one by one, claiming the house whispered at night, that footsteps echoed in empty corridors. Cornelius aged rapidly, his once powerful voice reduced to a cracked murmur. When he was found slumped at his dining table years later, his body was shriveled, his face locked in a rictus of terror. The walls around him were wet with condensation, though the night had been dry. Some said it was the house weeping. Randolph Manor was shuttered soon after, its windows boarded, its halls left to rot. Yet locals whispered that at night, music sometimes rose faintly from within. Violins warped and broken. A wedding feast played in reverse. And beneath it, always, the steady thump of a heartbeat. Children dared one another to press their ears to the crumbling foundation. Those who did swore they heard a woman's voice, hoarse and gasping, whispering the same words again and again, "Remember me." And so the tale endured. Parents spoke it to frighten their children from wandering too close. Sailors whispered it in the taverns of Annapolis, crossing themselves before setting sail. For though the Randolph fortune had crumbled into dust, the bride remained, sealed in her stone chamber, her curse woven into every beam and brick of the house that had become her tomb. The fatal wedding was not forgotten. It was immortal. Years passed, then decades, yet the story of the Randolph bride refused to fade. In Annapolis, where the brick streets held centuries of secrets, the tale passed from sailor to soldier, from innkeeper to tavern maid. It grew not smaller with time, but larger. Like a shadow cast across generations, old men at the docks swore that on stormy nights, when the tide rose high, you could hear her fingernails scraping from beneath the limestone bluff, a sound that carried over the water like a desperate warning. They said it made the gulls circle wide, crying as if in mourning, before scattering inland. Children who wandered too near Randolph Manor were told to stay silent, for if they called out, Margaret's voice might answer. A faint, girlish echo from the earth itself, an echo that invited you closer, closer, until you stood at the threshold of the cellar door. And once you stood there, the stories claimed, the handle would turn. Though no living hand touched it, even ministers, men of scripture and discipline, whispered their own fears. One wrote in his diary that he was summoned to the manor by townsfolk who swore they had seen lantern light moving through its abandoned halls. When he entered, he found no intruder, yet his lamp guttered out all the same. In the suffocating dark, he swore he felt a veil brush his face, soft silk damp with tears. He never entered the house again. The curse of the wedding spread beyond the family name. Merchants who had done business with the Randolphs suffered sudden financial collapse. Distant cousins who dared to claim the inheritance drowned in improbable accidents or went mad in their beds. The Randolph fortune, once the envy of Chesapeake society, seemed to poison all who touched it, leaving ruin as its only heir, and so the fatal wedding became more than a story. It became a warning. To the greedy, it whispered of retribution. To the disloyal, it promised betrayal. To the curious, it offered a dangerous allure, the temptation of secrets sealed behind stone. For the people of Annapolis, it was proof that some unions are never meant to be blessed, and some doors are never meant to be opened. Yet still, on October nights when the air turns sharp and the Chesapeake fog curls low, brave souls walk to the ruins of Randolph Manor. They kneel, press their ear to the cold earth, and listen. Most hear nothing but silence. But a chosen few swear they hear the faintest voice, a bride, still whispering her vow of vengeance. The fatal wedding is not only a ghost story. It is a mirror, a lesson carved in stone, hidden in plain sight. For what happened to Margaret Randolph is not merely a family crime of 1796. It is a pattern, one that repeats across centuries whenever wealth, bloodlines, and power collide. Margaret's entombment was not just physical. It was symbolic. A young woman silenced, buried beneath limestone, so that her inheritance could be consumed by men who saw her as an obstacle. A fortune turned into a coffin. Her life measured not in years, but in currency. This is how the powerful preserve themselves. By burying inconvenient voices, by walling away those who might expose the truth, by ensuring that heirs become sacrifices rather than successors. Look at the structure. A father, a husband, an uncle, a magistrate, a physician. The very pillars of authority, family, law, medicine, and government, united in conspiracy. Each lent their role to make the lie unshakable. A forged certificate, a sealed wall, a legal document, a whispered alibi. Together, they created a cage no ordinary person could escape. Does it not feel familiar? Even now, institutions function in the same way. Corporations hide behind lawyers, governments hide behind judges, and false identities are woven to extract wealth from the unsuspecting. Inheritance becomes a tool of manipulation, just as Margaret's was. Power flows upward, always upward, while those below are bricked into silence, whether literally, like Margaret, or figuratively, through contracts, debts, or psychological chains. The Randolph story endures because it speaks to a truth we sense but dare not name. That beneath every empire, every estate, every grand hall of marble and stone, lies a basement, a hidden chamber where the inconvenient are discarded. Sometimes it is a daughter, sometimes it is a rival, sometimes it is you. This is why the legend roots so deep. It is not about a bride who never made it to her marriage bed. It is about the machinery of control, the quiet, calculated willingness of those in power to entomb the living if it means preserving their own positions. It is about what happens when trust is weaponized and innocence becomes collateral. Margaret's scream did not stop in 1796. It echoes still, because the walls that bricked her in are not gone. They have simply been rebuilt in other forms: contracts, debts, algorithms, institutions. The stone has changed, but the prison remains. Listen closely, because this is the part they don't want you to hear. The fatal wedding was never just about 1796. It was a rehearsal, a prototype, a pattern the elite have perfected and repeated in endless variations. What they did to Margaret Randolph, they are still doing to you. You live inside walls you did not build. Every contract, every loan, every law written in words you never agreed to. All bricks, all mortar, sealing you in slowly. You dance above the basement like the wedding guests, distracted by music, by feasts, by promises of celebration. And all the while, beneath the floorboards, your future is being entombed. The Randolph conspirators wore familiar masks. The father who was supposed to protect her, the husband who promised devotion, the doctor who swore to heal, the judge who claimed to uphold truth. Now those same roles have been magnified into entire systems. The financial fathers, the corporate husbands, the institutional healers, the political judges. And still, they scheme together, smiling in public while plotting in private. Margaret's tragedy is that she trusted too long, questioned too late. She felt the lead weights sewn into her dress, but tried to rationalize them. She overheard the whispers, but hesitated to act. She walked willingly into the basement, because she could not believe those she loved most would betray her. And that hesitation became her tomb. What about you? Can you see the weights already sewn into your life? The distractions pulling you down, designed to make escape impossible. Can you hear the whispers? Politicians, bankers, experts, telling you what is for your own good, while sealing the door behind you? Or will you, like Margaret, wait until the wall is too high, until your screams are muffled by stone, The curse of Randolph Manor is not just a haunting. It is a warning. If you do not confront the system, it will bury you. If you do not question the lies, you will be bricked alive in a tomb of silence and obedience. But if you choose to hear Margaret scream, not as a ghost, but as a signal, you will understand. You will not be the guest dancing above the grave. You will not be the bride sealed beneath it. You will be the one who breaks the wall before it closes. The fatal wedding was theirs. What happens next is yours.